here as someone who's been in this movement for what seems like forever. You know, I just want to say to younger people here, like, I don't know if you realize how far we've come. We have just come so far to sit here and listen to so many incredible survivor leaders and see that movement emerging, you know, to be here with this panel, which I'm still in shock that we managed to have a report like this coming out of the UN. So it's a real pleasure for me to host this panel. We have with us, and I'm very fortunate to have her, Rima Al-Salem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, who was appointed by the Human Rights Council in 2021. She has extensive experience in the UN. She worked in UNHCR, serving in 13 countries. She's consulted for UN Women, for the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office, for UNICEF, IOM, and she's also worked in the NGO world and academia. She has a master's in international relations and a master's in human rights law. But as the UN Special Rapporteur, she recently published this report on prostitution and violence against women and girls, which will be presented in a few weeks to the Human Rights Council. And as I said, I am still in shock. Reading this report, it's not like reading words, it's like listening to music. It's just one of those moments. As someone who worked inside the UN for a number of years, many times, you know, it just is a total game changer for our work. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for doing this report. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But first, as mentioned, we have a video message from the French Minister of Equality, Aurore Berger. So maybe we can run that.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je tenais à vous adresser un message parce que l'action que vous menez, elle est absolument déterminante. Déterminante parce que vous le savez, la France partage avec vous cette vision abolitionniste sur la question de la prostitution. La France, elle est d'ailleurs à l'avant-garde sur cette question depuis la loi notamment de 2016, cette loi qui a permis de sortir les personnes en situation de prostitution d'une forme de criminalisation, comme si c'était elles qui étaient à mettre en accusation, alors qu'en fait, nous le savons, les personnes en situation de prostitution sont d'abord des victimes, victimes de l'exploitation sexuelle, victimes de la traite des êtres humains, victimes du proxénétisme, victimes de ceux qui en font le commerce ou qui abusent de leur corps. Et donc nous avons changé la loi pour garantir l'accompagnement de ces personnes, en étant le seul pays au monde à avoir des parcours de sortie de la prostitution et même une indemnité pour permettre à ces femmes, parfois aussi à ces hommes, d'être accompagnés évidemment financièrement et surtout de pouvoir se reconstruire socialement, professionnellement, psychologiquement au regard de ce qu'ils ont eu et de ce qu'elles ont eu à traverser. En tant que ministre de l'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes, de la lutte contre les discriminations, je suis allée plus loin puisque j'ai pu présenter une stratégie interministérielle. C'était la première fois que nous avions une stratégie interministérielle de lutte contre le système prostitutionnel, c'est-à-dire qu'avec d'autres ministres engagés, le ministère de l'Intérieur, le ministère de la Justice, le ministère de l'Enfance, le ministère de la Santé, eh bien nous avons travaillé conjointement parce que la prostitution, malheureusement, elle évolue et il y a de nouveaux territoires de prostitution. Deux en particulier, la question du numérique, parce que c'est aujourd'hui encore plus facile, malheureusement, d'avoir accès à des personnes vulnérables et de les exposer aux autres. Et donc, nous renforçons nos équipes de cyberdéfense qui sont liées véritablement à ces sujets, qui luttent contre cette forme de criminalité qui est organisée en ligne. Et puis, les nouveaux territoires, parce que malheureusement, là encore, les personnes concernées par la prostitution sont de plus en plus jeunes. Donc, nous voulons créer des lieux qui soient dédiés, des lieux refuges, pour leur permettre évidemment de se reconstruire au regard des séquelles qu'ils auraient pu subir. Et puis ce que je constate, et ce qui est formidable et très encourageant, c'est que des pays qui étaient très éloignés de la vision abolitionniste que nous partageons, eh bien, sont en train de nous rejoindre. J'étais il y a quelques jours à Madrid avec mon homologue espagnol et vous le savez, l'Espagne pourrait changer de législation pour venir plutôt sur la législation française. L'Allemagne aussi est traversée par des doutes justement sur cette forme de libéralisation que le pays avait acceptée et il voit bien aujourd'hui les difficultés majeures que cela peut provoquer. Alors je voulais vous dire merci pour votre mobilisation qui est absolument déterminante à l'international pour garantir que les personnes qui sont aujourd'hui dans le système prostitutionnel soient bien considérées toujours comme des victimes, soient bien toujours accompagnées sanitairement, socialement, professionnellement, psychologiquement. La France, elle est à l'avant-garde et la France va le rester sur ces sujets. Donc vous pouvez compter sur moi, compter sur nous pour vous accompagner dans toutes vos actions parce que nous espérons que cette vision que nous partageons, elle soit partagée demain par le plus grand nombre. En tout cas, c'est pour cela que nous nous battons à vos côtés. Je vous remercie.
Okay. Another ray of light and hope. So many countries changing their laws. Someone had told me 20 years ago, I'd hear that about Germany. You know, these are really astonishing developments. And it's because of this movement and all of the work that you all have been doing and we all have been doing, and in particular now that Rima Salam has been doing. So I'm going to start by just asking her to talk a little bit about the report. Hopefully all of you have seen it. If not, it's online and it will be officially presented in a few weeks to the Human Rights Council.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's really a great honor and privilege to be here, so I want to thank the organizers for having me here with you. I also want to say that if this report that I'm about to present has seen the light of day, it's really thanks to all of your efforts, all the frontline organizations, civil society organizations working with victims, but above all, the victims themselves, who have not shied away from providing the information that was needed, from sharing their experiences, despite continuing to experience trauma and the consequences of the violence they have faced, but also being at the risk of re-traumatization. So I'm incredibly grateful for all the support I have received in preparing this report. I have received over 300 submissions, most of them actually from abolitionist organizations, many victims around the world. So really, this is a tribute to all of you. You have made it happen, so thank you really very much for that. I want to confess, Jessica, and to all of you, that this issue didn't come naturally to me. In fact, I may say that I was one of those people who did not really give this issue much thought in the past, who may have also simplified this situation of prostitution. But if there is one thing I did correctly since assuming my mandate as Special Rapporteur, is I said to myself that I will always be guided by what feminist organizations want, things should be done, things should be prioritized. So I kept an open mind, and it became quickly very clear to me through the conversations that we had that not only is this a situation of extreme violence, to which many women and girls are subjected to systematically across the world, but also that it is part of this incredibly dangerous, large-scale offensive that is being launched right now by the patriarchy, by the evolved patriarchy, against the rights of women and girls. And therefore it became a no option for me, really. I had to deal with this, particularly since, as you know, and since all the fantastic, eloquent speakers beforehand mentioned, there is a very strong push to try to normalize it, to try to legalize it, decriminalize it, demonize the experiences of victims, demonize also the work of feminist and grassroots organizations. So this is where we are today. I know that many of you have seen the report. In a nutshell, it validates a lot of, actually all of what we heard from the previous speakers. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail again, except to say that I would like just to highlight a few aspects of the report, but mainly also focus on the recommendations. So I do conclude that prostitution is a system of exploitation, an aggregated form of male violence against women and girls that intersects with other forms of structural discrimination. And in fact, it is perpetrated, as I said, systematically by a wide web of state and non-state actors that seek to subjugate, control, exploit women and girls in violation of their fundamental human rights. The key issue is violation of their fundamental human rights. It is high time we saw this issue as a human rights issue. Women and children are victims that were forced by their situation, by their vulnerability, by pre-existing discrimination, as we said, into entering and staying and being trapped in prostitution. And this extreme level of violence inflicted on women and girls would never be accepted in other contexts, as we have heard. We would never expect people enslaved to accept their enslavement. We would never expect people who are starving to just accept that and engage in prostitution and legitimize that. So here it is being legitimized by financial transaction designed to materialize the so-called quote-unquote consent that cannot in any case be freely expressed in the prostitution system. So in a way, the concept of consent is weaponized against women and girls in prostitution. It is extorted through physical and economic coercion, manipulation, and violence. So coercion is integral to the prostitution system, facilitating entry as well as control, exploitation by pimps, traffickers, but also the state. And attempts to ignore the devastating consequences for women and girls and wider society is also an extension of the historic normalization of women's stereotyped role in society and the commodification of female sexual and reproductive capacities. So it is also a way to try to say that societies have accepted that the most marginalized women and girls, as we heard, Black, brown, migrant, indigenous, are overrepresented in prostitution, have been legitimizing violence against them and their exploitation by normalizing the prostitution system as a means of livelihood and survival. And the perceived right of men to purchase a sex act normalizes this systematic violence inflicted on women and girls through prostitution, including in pornography. So in my report, I have looked systematically at pornography because for me it is film prostitution. And so it is really part and parcel of this report. And pornography in particular, I would say, erases the boundaries between what counts as sex and what counts as sexual violence. And this violence that is enacted against women and children, including girls in pornography, such as strangulation, defecation, is often reenacted against girls and women by those who consume pornography in the physical world. And so we see an increase in rape, including gang rape, by, as was said earlier, younger and younger boys. And this, I think, can be linked to an increased male consumption of pornography. So this is incredibly clear, and it's incredibly clear also that this technology facilitated prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation is growing at an alarming rate. And I'm afraid, as was said, that we have really not gotten a grip on it. And unless we act very quickly, it's gonna still get even more out of hand. You all know that pornography generated by artificial intelligence further distorts what constitutes normal sexual interaction, and it encourages viewers to adopt more harmful sexual attitudes. So, since it is a business, it is based on this model that you need to present more novel, more extreme forms of violence and violent content. And also the users or the viewers need more novel and more extreme forms of violence to achieve the same level of arousal, which they will never really achieve. So it makes it much more difficult to find pleasure in real-life sexual encounters. Since we're talking about states, my fear is that the current push to decriminalize and legalize prostitution is part of a wider, let's say, emerging trend to try to absolve the state of its responsibilities towards the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, is to try to sanction, basically, that these groups not only fall through the cracks, but that they have to be responsible for their own salvation in a way, and have to adapt to their exploitation and to their abuse. So, as was said before, we see this also in the emerging conversations and practices around surrogacy and so on and so forth. So here there is really a risk of states, not just a risk, but we see actually a situation where states have become pimping states. So tolerating, condoning the violence and exploitation, the prostitution system, and in some instances also taxing prostituted women and normalizing this as work. And states, therefore, need to come back to what is their human rights obligation, but also their responsibility towards victims of violence and towards women and girls, and need to exert their responsibility to protect, assist, and protect and support victims of prostitution in a gender and sex-sensitive manner, and also to provide reparations because they have failed their duty to uphold the rights of women and girls. And of course, they have a responsibility to address the underlying causes of violence that include eliminating the demand, addressing the socio-economic inequalities, the discrimination, the marginalization. And we have to also provide women, girls, the right to access equality, freedom from violence, right to life, liberty, security, dignity, freedom from torture. All these are fundamental human rights. So in my report, I do also recommend that states adopt an abolitionist framework and model with its 5 pillars that all of you know, and that there are comprehensive tailored services to victims in prostitution. Terminology is a central part of the report. I very much agree that we have to use human rights-based terminology to describe prostitution and refrain from using terminology that mischaracterizes it, misrepresents it, and minimizes the serious human rights violations. That said, prostituted women and girls should be treated as victims. They should be treated with compassion. They need to be decriminalized, and we have to offer them the status as victims. So we have to offer them protection, validate their experiences, support their recovery, and there needs to be funds to support victims that should be also financed by the state and not just by non-state actors. The other issue is that I wanted to highlight is that states should avoid the weaponization of these anti-trafficking policies to avoid addressing the issue of prostitution as a form of violence against women by creating a harmful and artificial dissociation between the so-called forced prostitution assimilated to trafficking from a so-called free prostitution assimilated to sex work. And I'm very glad that the minister, in fact, spoke about this interministerial committee or sort of working group that she referred to, because this really needs to bring together all the ministries, not just the Ministry of Equality or Women Affairs. It's really the responsibility, not just of governments, but it has to be an all-society approach that also looks at education, looks at the way the media speaks about prostitution and about the experiences of prostituted women and girls, and law enforcement, obviously, the judiciary. We have to bring also more concrete support to all of you grassroots organizations that are working with the victims at great personal and professional cost. I know that all of you experience an enormous amount of attacks, threats, and as I said, you are frequently ignored and dismissed, and many of you are not even invited to discussions, policy discussions around this issue. So we have to make sure that also civil society organizations working with victims and victim organizations are supported. I also think that it's high time that we hold businesses and industries participating in this accountable for their role in the exploitation of prostitution. And we have to also make sure that UN agencies, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit more, also adopt a human rights-centered approach on prostitution. And there are two recommendations that I make specifically to two UN agencies. One of them is to the ILO, that they actually show how prostitution doesn't fit the principles of dignified work. And the other thing is to look at the health consequences of prostitution beyond what we always hear about the increased risk of infection with HIV. There are many endemic, long-standing, horrific health consequences of prostitution that nobody really in the UN talks about, if I may say. So this is also very important. So I will stop here, but I encourage you please to read the report, and I really welcome also your feedback here. Thank you.
That was a fantastic overview. Thank you for that and for the report. I have a ton of questions, so I'm going to just throw out a few, and hopefully we can get some more of your thoughts on some of these important issues. I also noted all the interministerial discussion by the French minister, and I think that's great as a model. But of course, we globally also really would like to see more international collaboration. I know Sweden and France had announced a couple of years ago that they're going to do a joint venture of some sort. We're still waiting for that to kind of unfold. And I think there's so much that can be done. And this is just my observation that over the years, this issue has been advocacy driven, not states. States are following very loud minority viewpoints that have been expressed. And so I'm wondering, I know you mentioned you did an extensive consultation in writing the report, 300 submissions. I know you did lots of regional consultations. I'm wondering, knowing what the lines of division are, was there anything in the consultations that surprised you in any way?
So I was very careful to include organizations and individuals from across the divide so that no one feels left out, and therefore nobody could use that as an excuse to attack the report. So therefore we had 7 consultations covering the 6 regions of the world, and one of those consultations was also dedicated to victims, with victims from across the world. So it involved 86 individuals. It became very clear to me almost immediately that I was walking into a minefield, especially in those consultations where we had really people with very diverse and opposing views. I had understood that actually you don't often meet in common spaces. I think in the past attempts were made and they failed, and so this was like a rare opportunity to have people with opposing views in the same room. It was very tense at times, but I think it was very enlightening. So since, as I said, I'm an outsider coming into this, it was clear, for example, there are very fundamental differences around the terminology issue, whether prostitution is a system of exploitation and violence or not, the views on state responsibility and the models that states should adopt. The issue of consent, obviously, and freedom of choice and bodily autonomy came up. But also what was very interesting from my perspective is that when I probed sort of the quote-unquote sex work lobby further to unpack their positions, that was not very possible. Let's put it that way. It stopped at a certain moment. Like there was a limit to how far you could go. And if I can say one thing that really surprised me in those consultations was actually to hear what we heard here today, also the overrepresentation of certain groups of women as victims of prostitution. I was not aware of that, and it really shocked me. The way it really perpetuates these structural discriminations and racism and sexism also against women. So that for me was an eye-opener. Yeah.
I think more state consultations will follow the publication of your report as you go to the Human Rights Council, and I should note that in October, I assume you'll be also presenting the report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly in New York. So those are all opportunities for us to hear what may almost be like the first time where states are put this so directly and squarely in front of them that they have to respond, and often they don't so much respond. But my sense is that overall, on the legislative front, there is a slow but steady wave of progress, despite the intense opposition sometimes. And here, or not here, in the U.S., where I live, we just recently got the first equality law passed in Maine, and that was an exciting moment. We're hoping for a few states to follow soon. We're keeping an eye on Spain, Germany, and all of these states that are thinking or rethinking this. So in the big picture, do you feel that things are moving in the right direction?
I think it's a mixed bag, and I'd be interested to hear from those who live in countries that are abolitionists. But my sense is that the governments of these countries are timid and shy about their models, and do not also speak about them and their achievements in international and regional fora as much as they should, actually. I understand the reasons for that. I mean, I understand some countries, by definition, for example, don't want to be seen as, neo-colonialist or exploiting or imposing certain models. But I think they need to be more vocal about how their model is human rights based. Also be very clear about their limitations and their challenges, because as we know, France and Sweden and others are also not doing this fantastically well still, and have still a lot of shortcomings. And I think we need this more vocal positioning, because of course the other lobby is very powerful, very well resourced, very influential, and very and has expertise, right? And is infiltrating all the decision-making places, whether it's international organizations, whether it's states, whether it's the legislature, and is also moving at an enormous speed. So we need to also, these countries have to also react more assertively. I want to also make this suggestion to all of you. There are countries that deny that prostitution even exists for also religious, social, cultural reasons. They don't want to even go there. And they also may have problematic policies on equality between men and women. But I want to make the appeal that for all of you to still reach out to them and to engage them and to speak to them, because we can still influence them, right? We shouldn't shy away of that because of what we think is their position on women and girls in general. No country in the world has a perfect policy on equality, and all states that I know, that I've visited, violate women's rights in many ways. So please speak not just to the converted, but reach out across the divide and try to also convince countries that are either sitting on the fence or are ignoring this problem or have no policy, because that's where you can still make an impact.
Thank you. I want to just come back to the UN agencies, since you mentioned that. And of course, it's one thing for states and legislatures to debate this issue. And thanks hugely to you and to CEDAW. We also now, among the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, we at least have some advocacy within these UN this UN universe. And for many of us, I think the UN has been an important forum, or really, I should say, battleground. And a lot of that has been with regard to UN agencies, you know, many, many years to fight back UN Women's effort to try to move in the direction of supporting prostitution. And of course, all of this historically has been led by UNAIDS, so we also have an ongoing effort to try to get UNAIDS to relook at all of that. But I guess my question is, when it comes to UN agencies, does it make sense for each of them to be taking these different positions? Should we be fighting for them, I think, as you mentioned earlier, with regard to WHO or ILO, to take a position compatible with ours, or because member states have different views about this, should we be just arguing for neutrality?
Yeah, so having been a UN staff myself for 17 years, I understand the challenges that come with UN agencies tackling sensitive, potentially explosive issues around which there is a lot of disagreement. So I understand that, it's not easy. However, that has been also my message to the UN agencies, that just because an issue is sensitive and problematic doesn't mean that you should shy away from it. Because a number of agencies, as you rightly mentioned, prefer to say that they have no position on this. But by having no position, they actually have a position, because they're allowing the to continue. Also, by having no position, but then using problematic terminology, which we all have been guilty of, including myself, before I produced this report, we are therefore bringing in a position through the back door, through the backside, and creating facts on the ground, and also pushing jurisprudence into a certain direction. So that has been my message to UN agencies. I'm hoping that that this report will encourage them, but also encourage states to go back to the basics. What are the human rights involved, and what are the violations that women and girls are being subjected to, and what are the responsibilities, therefore, not just of state, of all actors, to change that reality, because that is the fundamental obligation of not just the UN, but all actors, right, is to respect the human rights of everyone, including women and girls. So I was very surprised, actually, that prior to this report, there hasn't been a detailed, comprehensive human rights analysis on prostitution. There's been bits and pieces here and there, like playing at the extremities of things, on HIV, on the issue of acknowledging, on issue of trafficking, looking at it almost always through the angle of trafficking, which is also problematic. But there hasn't been a comprehensive analysis, so that is really problematic, yeah.
Well, I think there have probably been many efforts to undermine the idea or possibility of a comprehensive analysis, so you've done an incredible hurdle. And you mentioned earlier that you yourself had an open mind, you came to this issue without strong feelings. I think, and I think we all think, that the arguments for abolition and for the equality model are so clear and compelling, and when you make them to people, most people haven't thought deeply about these issues, and it's really not such a hard path for them to agree. And yet there's this intense opposition in the sex trade, which is so vicious at times, so much more on many of the other issues that divide us. And I'm wondering, firstly, why do you think that is? Is it the financial piece of it? Is it an ideological piece of it? And presumably you have experienced some of this hostility, which we politely call tension. But I wonder if you want to share any thoughts with us on that, and anything in particular about what we can do when there is so much pressure to get more people like you, and especially prominent leaders, to speak out rather than to lay low and just avoid it altogether. How do we push back effectively and change the culture so that it publicly reflects more, accurate and widely represented beliefs on the harms of prostitution?
So maybe to say, for those who may not know this, but I have a bit of a privileged position as a special rapporteur, in that I am actually an independent expert. So I'm not a staff of the United Nations. I know the UN appears in the title, but that's because I was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. But we are not staff, we don't receive a salary, and we are asked to do human rights work in our independent capacity. which is great in a sense that I don't have to abide necessarily by what the UN says. I have to really basically serve my conscience, you know, and do the best that I can. But on the other hand, of course, it means that I may not find many allies on certain positions. So that's the downside of it. The thing, though, I would maybe disagree that the issue of prostitution is the only issue where there's a lot of polarization and hostility and difficulties of having a dialogue, because of course we know, we can all think of many other issues where we have the same kind of dynamics at play. One of them, if I may say, is the whole issue of sex-based rights, gender identity, for example. That's another one. I think surrogacy will soon come into play. There is the long-standing issue of abortion, of course, that is becoming also more and more problematic. So it's a feature of our time, unfortunately, that we can't seem to have constructive conversations without trying to undermine and attack and cancel the other. So, yeah.
So, last question. What are your hopes and fears for this report? And maybe most importantly, what can we do to maximize its impact?
So I hope that everybody understands that the report is a tool. It's not an end in itself. And in fact, a report is only as good as the input on which it is based and the analysis, but also how stakeholders use it. So I'm hoping really that it can be useful to you in your sort of fight with and the struggle to address and deal with prostitution the way it should be dealt with, but also that it helps you to advance the conversations with states, with legislators, and that it provides really this, at least a glimpse of the evidence that you all have been speaking about, and in a compact, concentrated manner, with also a UN logo, which is important after all. I've already spoken about the need to engage states, to continue to engage UN agencies. I would like to make an appeal, and I know it's not easy because we're all very short of resources, but we need to think more about ways to lobby international organizations at regional and international level, and really to develop advocacy strategies to find ways to be there in the conversations, because there are certain organizations that are in all the conversations and others that are not, despite the fact that they are the ones who work on the ground and they are the ones who work with victims and they know the needs and they know the challenges. So that is something that all of you and all of us really need to think about together. And please do count on my support. I will do whatever I can to support you with that. Also to think of engaging and reaching out to a wider range of stakeholders. So not focusing on only one class of actors, but for example, I would say parents are a very important constituency that you should bring into this conversation. All of them are parents to boys and girls. All of them, have mothers. So we need to bring in the average individual also into this conversation. And given that maybe access to resources from states can sometimes be problematic, given that they have their own priorities, I think it's important to find then individual philanthropists, affluent persons. We have one of them here, Mrs. Jensen. So we need to find more such persons that are willing actually to support your efforts, and that can then also provide the required sort of support, including financial, but also otherwise. Strategic litigation is really important on criminalizing PIMS and also holding states accountable. So to work more on the litigation fronts. And then, of course, to keep producing data and evidence and to try to change the conversation in the media, also in society, which is not going to be easy. I take that. Yeah. Thank you.
So, it feels so unfair for me to get to ask all the questions. And we just thought, maybe, I know we're running a little late, but we caught up on some time. We could just take a few questions from you, if anyone, 2 questions, okay. 2 questions. One there, one there. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Hema, for picking me. My name is Kerstin Neuhaus, and I'm from the Alliance Nordic Model in Germany. And we try our very best to bring the Nordic model to Germany, and we're very, very thankful for your report. I'm sure it will help a lot. And one of our issues in Germany is that UN Women Germany is strongly against the Nordic model. Do you see any possibility that this report could help us open a door at UN Women Germany?
Yes, definitely, and it's definitely something then you should take up with UN Women headquarters, because my understanding is UN Women does not have a position. So, yeah.
Okay. Here. I think that we should pick a person here.
Hello, I have just a question about something you mentioned when you spoke about debating with opposite, sides, and you said something like you realized that at one stage there was no possibility to go further with the pro-sex lobby, and I was wondering why. Was it because they didn't want to go any further themselves, or because they had no further arguments? I just wanted to have a bit of, more explanations about that. Thank you.
Yes, so my experience has been that it's similar talking points that you hear from the sex work lobby, and when you probe to get into further details or evidence or understand certain assertions they make, it's not possible to go further. Yeah. The issue of consent, I would say, the freedom of choice, that consent in international law has a limitation, right? It's not at all expense, and consent in inherently exploitative and violent situation doesn't count. So I found that there would be an acknowledgement that it is very violent, that there can be experiences of violence, but and that this is the experience of many. But then the explanation is yes, but not everybody, right? And the many is a situation that happens when women are trafficked, as if it's just an experience in trafficking situations, right? But we know that is also not true. So when you want to unpack all these issues, you sort of fall short in the answers.
Thank you. That was one of my questions too. So it's really just a huge privilege to have you here with us. Thank you so much for the report. At the end of this tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to have